So I left off talking about how La Virgen de Guadalupe is often depicted as mestiza, meaning that she is of mixed ancestry. And that right there brings me into the last major point that I want to talk about during this quick discussion. And that is social hierarchy in Latin America during the colonial period. So, as you might imagine, even with 85 to 95% of all indigenous people dying over the course of the first 150 years after occupation and colonization by Europeans, they still outnumbered Spanish populations in Latin America. So what you see is that by the 1600s and 1700s, the Spanish colonies develop a very extraordinarily rigid social system. And this system is based on both ethnicity and based on race. This is known as el sistema de castas, the caste system. So one thing I want to point out is that during the early colonial process, really it was only Spanish men who came over into the Spanish American colonies. It was conquistadores, it was priests, and then it was young men who were seeking their fortunes or escaping Spain for some reason, some sort of social disgrace. It really wasn't until a couple of generations in that you had maybe Spanish women coming over. And what that meant was that very, very early on, within the first months of colonization, you have Spanish men starting voluntary relationships with indigenous women and involuntary ones. Part of the process of conquest also often involves sexual violence. What that means is that very shortly after conquest, you have the first generation of people who will be identified as mestizo, meaning that they are of mixed ancestry, that they have one parent, usually the father, who is of European ancestry, and one parent, usually the mother, who is of indigenous ancestry. Now, these relationships are extraordinarily difficult for us to parse because often we know that they were born of rape. But sometimes Spanish men did marry these indigenous women. How much of that was still voluntary is deeply difficult for us to kind of parse out. But what it did mean was that you had children who were seen as legitimate in the eyes of the church and in the eyes of their parents who were of different ethnicity. And the question is, how did the state recognize those people? So, what developed was a very strict and very strange hierarchy. At the very top of the social pyramid were a group of people who were called peninsulares. Peninsulares was in reference to the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula. And peninsulares were people who were born in Spain, and they were almost always white aristocrats. I say almost always because technically what mattered was that you were born in Spain. And so actually you could be like of North African descent and technically be a peninsular. But that was like a really small little exception to the rule. So like 99.9% of the time, when we say peninsulares, we mean white aristocrats, people with money and privilege coming from Spain. And they held all the important positions in the colonial government, the military, and the church. If you were the Archbishop of Nueva España, the Archbishop of New Spain, you were clearly a peninsular. If you were the viceroy, the person who essentially acted in place of the king because the king was back in Spain, you were clearly a peninsular. So that was a really powerful position. And then you had this secondary group of people called criollos. And we translate it in English to Creoles, and that probably makes you think of Louisiana, but like to be Creole just means to be mixed, but we don't mean it in terms of race. We mean it in terms of culture, which is weird. So criollos were still white. They were of European descent. They had two parents of European descent, but they were not born in Spain. they were born in the Americas. And there was this weird notion that if you were born in the Americas, you were somehow like less civilized than people who were born in Europe. Like it had some sort of like barbarian influence over you. And so criollos were slightly lower on the social order. You shouldn't feel bad for these people, though. They were still incredibly wealthy, incredibly privileged, and they just couldn't hold the highest offices in the land. They owned most of the land in capital because there were very few peninsulares in Nueva España or in Peru, in the two major colonies in Spain, in the Americas rather. But they were held out of like archbishoprics or out of the viceroyalities. But everything else they could do, they could be bishops, they could be governors, they could be generals, like they were wealthy people. So they just didn't have the highest amount of power. And they were very clearly aware of that. So then you have people who are of mixed ancestry. And I am using a term here, it's the second term that you see, that is sometimes very distressing for people. And I'm not going to say it, but it is historically the term that was used, and legally the term that was used in Spain, in Spanish America. The first term, mestizo, is very widely used, and depending on where you are in Latin America, the second one may still be very widely used. In the US, I'm not going to use it. But these terms described people of mixed ancestry. Someone who was mestizo was of indigenous and European ancestry. The other term refers to someone who was of African and European ancestry. And that usually was the result of sexual assault in enslaved populations. These people, however, were usually recognized by the Spanish crown as free-born, usually. The case of enslaved people giving birth to like children by their master, it really depended on the individual plantation system as to how that worked. But generally, these people owned very little land, if they owned any. They usually worked as unskilled laborers, servants, farmhands, or overseers. If they chose to go into the church, which some of them did because at least it was a reliable income, or perhaps they felt a particular call to it, they could serve as priests, they could become monks or nuns, but they could never hold high office within the church, or at least not early on. These people, like I said, were technically free, but they could only hold minor positions. You could be an enlisted soldier, maybe promoted up to a sergeant, but you weren't going to move beyond that. And then below that, broadly, there are a whole range of people. And I'm going to skip over it right now, but I'll show you an illustration in a moment to give you an idea of what I mean. Then you had populations who were identified as indios, which could sometimes be seen as a slur, although it just translates to Indians. But these were indigenous people. Usually these people did not own land even after the encomienda system ended, and they had very few legal rights and protections. Remember, they had the legal rights of children. And then at the very bottom of the Spanish social order, you had enslaved people who had no rights because they weren't seen as property. They weren't seen as people, they were seen as property. Now, this system actually gets way more complicated than what I just described. This is a very weird genre of paintings that were very, very common in the 18th century in Spain, and they are called casta paintings, sistema de casta. It's the caste system paintings. And in it, you'll notice that there are these little depictions of families, a mother, a father, and then a child. And it's basically doing a weird enlightenment-y thing where they're trying to determine exactly what everybody with various racial backgrounds is called. They're categorizing people like you would categorize butterflies. So basically what it says is like Español, a Spanish person, con India, with an indigenous person, equals mestizo. A mestizo con un española, okay, a mestizo, a mixed individual with a Spanish woman, is called a castizo. Castizo con española, that is an español. So, like, if you only have one indigenous parent, then you're essentially legally white. And there's all sorts of weird terms for this sort of stuff, guys. Yeah, there's some weird stuff here. This one, mestizo con India, is a coyote, is a coyote. Like, there's all these weird terms. And some of them are pretty dang racist. So this is how the Spaniards sort of colonized Latin America. They tried to have a lot of control over their territory, and for a long time it worked until we get to Napoleon. So I'm going to stop this discussion right now, and then what I want you to do is a really quick exercise out of your textbook looking at North American colonies, particularly looking at the English, the Dutch, and the French.